In this present crisis, government is not the solution to our problem. Government is the problem.
Those remarks are from Ronald Reagan's 1980 inaugural address and are the basis for tonight's debate, which is a production of SECA. Funding for this special debate is provided by Hillsdale College.
Good evening. From Hillsdale College in Hillsdale, Michigan, welcome to a live all-star firing line debate. Ronald Reagan spoke the words that frame our debate 10 years ago. Government is not the solution to our problem, he said. Government is the problem. History does not record which government-paid speechwriter actually wrote those immortal lines. But William F. Buckley's private sector firing line staff has efficiently edited them down to the following proposition. Resolved, government is not the solution, it is the problem. I'm the moderator tonight. My name is Mike Kinsley of the New Republic magazine. It's fitting that we hold this debate at Hillsdale College, which prides itself on accepting no government support and bending to no government regulation. I'm sure we all feel duly ashamed at having arrived here on a government-financed interstate highway and at broadcasting this debate on the government-subsidized public broadcasting system. Thank you. In the spirit of Hillsdale, there has, of course, been no affirmative action to assure an ideologically balanced live audience tonight. But I'm sure that at least at the beginning, we'll want to give an equally warm welcome to all our debaters. So let's bring them on right now. We promised you stars tonight, and for once at least, that description would meet the most stringent Federal Trade Commission standards. Joining the regulars on the conservative team is Moses the lawgiver himself, Charlton Heston. It's ironic to... I think we better restrain our enthusiasm till the end here. It's ironic to find Mr. Heston on the anti-government side this evening, since in his most famous acting role, he delivered the first and most burdensome set of burdensome government regulations ever issued, the 10 Commandments. Even Hillsdale College is not trying to get those repealed. At least I think so. Mr. Heston has been politically active all his life, formerly in the civil rights movement, more recently making ads for the National Rifle Association, among other things. Like Ronald Reagan, he served as president of the Screen Actors Guild. Joining the Liberal team tonight is another former president of the Screen Actors Guild, Dennis Weaver. Mr. Weaver is best known for his role as Chester in the TV series Gunsmoke and as the crime fighter McCloud in the TV series of that name. Sam McCloud, is played by Mr. Weaver, recently reappeared on TV in a TV movie as a U.S. senator elected on an environmental platform. That tells you where Mr. Weaver's head is at these days. Even as an environmental activist, however, Mr. Weaver does not think government should do it all. He is currently building a solar house in Colorado out of used automobile tires and aluminum cans, all products of the private sector. Now, the captain of the affirmative team is also the supreme commander of this whole enterprise, William F. Buckley, Jr., founder and editor of National Review, founder and star of Firing Line. Although opposed to big government, Mr. Buckley is not opposed to using his own authoritarian powers in these debates to make sure that his team is labeled affirmative and always gets to go first. Tonight, as is often the case, this trick is achieved by strategic use of the word not. Resolved, government is not the solution. It's sort of the yes, we have no bananas approach to defining a debate. Captain of the opposing negative team is former Senator and Democratic presidential nominee George McGovern. This is also odd when you think about it, since Mr. McGovern rose to fame as an opponent of a big government initiative known as the Vietnam War. More recently, Mr. McGovern has joined the private sector himself. He owns and runs a hotel in Connecticut. Its slogan, I understand, is "Come home, America, but stop here on your way." If small businessman McGovern has any war stories about the burdens of taxes and regulations on the small business he runs, I don't think we're going to hear them tonight. Jeane Kirkpatrick returns to the conservative team tonight. After 4 controversial years as our ambassador to the United Nations, she now scrapes together a living in the private sector as a professor at Georgetown University, senior fellow of the American Enterprise Institute, syndicated columnist, speechwriter, and writer of books. As the famous intellectual promoter of the distinction between totalitarian and authoritarian regimes, she would surely acknowledge that some governments are less of a problem than others. At least I hope so. Representative Pat Schroeder of Representative Pat Schroeder of Colorado, a regular on the Liberal team, is now the senior woman in Congress. She serves prominently on the House Armed Services and Judiciary Committees. Ms. Schroeder describes herself as a, quote, fiscally conservative liberal. Now, the audience here at Hillsdale is probably thinking, that is like calling yourself a religiously atheistic Catholic or a steak-loving vegetarian. But few would dare to call Pat Schroeder an oxymoron, at least to her face. Now for a disappointment. Newt Gingrich, the House Republican whip, will not be here as advertised. Fittingly enough, Mr. Gingrich is being held prisoner at Andrews Air Force Base, along with other congressional and White House officials, at the so-called Budget Summit. But Newt has not been silent these days. While lesser mortals argue about tax increases versus spending cuts, Mr. Gingrich has been fairly calling for a tax cut. He represents that brand of conservative that is not against big government, just against paying for it, sort of a fiscally liberal conservative. In Mr. Gingrich's stead, though, we have a certified budget cutter, Representative Dick Armey of Texas. Mr. Armey is a professional economist, and he led the successful effort in the last Congress to close obsolete military bases. Since then, he has launched a crusade against government farm subsidies, a cause that will make him plenty of enemies, even in the rolling conservative hills of Hillsdale. Finally, rounding out the Liberal team is former Senator and Democratic presidential candidate Gary Hart. Mr. Hart made his reputation in the Senate as a military reformer before making his reputation on the campaign trail as a, well, there were many descriptions, but fiscally conservative liberal was not one of them. Mr. Hart is now an international lawyer, and he's writing a book about the new Soviet revolution. So that's the lineup. Mr. Buckley, please come to the podium and propose the resolution.
Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, I and my colleagues are happy to be here, even though the task you set before us is embarrassingly easy to undertake. As a matter of fact, Mr. Chairman, I should like to propose a tribute to our opponent here tonight, to Congressperson Schroeder, and to Senators Hart and McGovern, and to Mr. Weaver for their courage. Anyone willing to stand up in public and aver that the government is the solution, not the problem, deserves a first prize for raw physical courage. So, if you promise not to deduct it from my 3 minutes, can we have just a little round of applause? If we train our faculties on the problem, Mr. Chairman, enlisting the faculty of Hillsdale College to assist us, I am certain that we can find something that the government has done that is useful and productive. One thinks, for instance, of the Bureau of Weights and Measures, which, as far as I know, has done nothing in my lifetime or even in the 150-year history of this college to shrink or enlarge the foot, exaggerate the dimension of an inch, or corrupt the cubic content of a quart. Yes, and now again the government put a traitor in jail, which was good work, but then why were we afraid of traitors except that they could deliver us into the hands of a hostile government? But as I say, we are, on my side of the aisle, moderates, not anarchists. Someone asked the great British economist Alfred Marshall whether he didn't agree that the Liberal government in Great Britain had got some things right, and we all know that he answered that even a stopped clock is right twice a day. So perhaps we can accept that as a metaphorical challenge. For every measure accomplished by the government that this House approves of, we will undertake to question its handling of 12. 12 to 1, we accept the odds. The current issue of Time magazine bemoans the fate of New York City, whose deterioration only yesterday in the New York Times was likened to, quote, the sinking feeling that accompanies that moment in a boat when you find water in your shoes. There are bad people around, as Adam discovered in the Garden of Eden. Were you there when they crucified our Lord? But what is it that gives bad people that special leverage to, well, to cause great wars? 9 million people were killed in the First World War, 15 in the Second World War. To do what? To arrest the consolidated power of madmen in charge of governments. If Hitler hadn't had 400 divisions, he'd have been a routine anti-Semite like Gerald L.K. Smith, as much of a menace as a Ku Klux Klan, which we can cope with without the use of the atom bomb. We suffer a huge loss from the savings and loan crisis. Why? Because the government guaranteed $100,000 savings accounts without any binding reference to how the money was going out. The children of New York City graduate in higher and higher percentages into illiteracy because the New York schools are non-governmental? No, the private schools are sending their graduates to college. Do you know why everyone in New York who can do so communicates via messenger or Federal Express or fax? Because messengers and Federal fax and fax machines are not government enterprises like the post office. We borrow the topic here tonight at Hillsdale, which, by the way, admitted women and graduated blacks about 100 years before the government got around to making any laws on the subject from Ronald Reagan. It was he who said that the government is more nearly the problem than the solution. This is my last sentence, so don't waste your energy. That statement is so straightforwardly correct, it embarrasses us that you have the burden of contradicting it. But put on your makeup and your masks and jingle your bells and act the role of the wonderful fools celebrated in Shakespeare's courts, and we will honor your theatrical talents to disguise your real feelings. We are we not, Jeane, an understanding lot? Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. McGovern, step up to the podium and oppose the motion, please. Try to be a little impartial, the audience here at Hillsdale.
On behalf of my colleagues, I want to express our appreciation to President Roach and Hillsdale College, and also to Bill Buckley for arranging this debate. I think at the outset, I have a confession to make. I'm a teacher by profession. I've now had some 12 or more joint appearances with Bill Buckley, and I think it's quite clear I haven't been able to teach him a thing. Government is not the solution, it is the problem, is one of those propositions that cries out for definition. I assume that Mr. Buckley and company do not want to abolish the government entirely. This is a matter of degrees. If they do, who's going to provide for the defense of the country? The Pentagon does make some mistakes. It does waste some money, as all know, but we do have to have an Army, a Navy, an Air Force, and the Marines. And so we assume that our opponents, with the possible exception of Mr. Heston, don't want to depend entirely on the National Rifle Association for the defense of the country. I suspect that when Buckley and company say government is the problem, they would like to limit that to the economy. They want a free market, as they define it, no government regulation, no Social Security, no minimum wage, and no taxes. In short, they want a Reagan-type government that generally serves the rich, ignores the poor, and lets the middle class pay for it. Those who attack government really want no regulation of such things as the savings and loan industry. And as a consequence, that industry allowed to run wild with no congressional oversight and no federal regulation has left us a $500 billion bill to pay, about $2,000 for every man, woman, and child in the country. Nor do they want any regulation to protect us from the pollution of the air that sustains life, the water that we drink, the land that we live on. Now, obviously, government is far from a perfect institution, but the answer is not to weaken it, but to give it more careful citizen attention and better qualified people. This debate proposition reminds me of Groucho Marx's observation that marriage is the chief cause of divorce. The answer is not to abolish marriage, but to strive for better marriages, and so it is with government. Government has caused some problems, no question about that, and I've spoken out against some of those problems, but it has also come up with some inspired solutions under the leadership of such Americans as George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Abraham Lincoln, Franklin Roosevelt. And we can do it again if you will listen tonight to McGovern, Schroeder, Hart, and Weaver instead of Buckley, Heston, Armey, and Kirkpatrick.
Mr. Heston, please take the podium and make a statement.
Just a point of order before we start the clock. I'm distressed that my captain would imply that actors do not say what they mean. I promise you, I mean what I say here. It's seldom that liberty of any kind is lost all at once. David Hume, the great Scottish philosopher, said that. I'm a Scot myself. He was bloody right. For more than half a century, the shining republic created by the blood of the Continental Army and a few great men has been nearly nibbled to death by the Democratic ducks in the Congress and a warmly cooperative Supreme Court. There's now no aspect of American life, public or private, that the federal government does not invade, instruct, and finally coerce to its will. Farm and factory, home and school, university and research center, club and playground, all are overlaid with a spidery network of laws, guidelines, restrictions, and draconian penalties that stifle the spirit, the energy, the creative capacity of what was once the freest nation on earth. In this hemisphere, now that Ortega and Noriega have fallen, the collectivist sentiments discredited around the world thrive best, I fear, in Cuba and Washington, D.C. Of course, government is the problem. Thank you. Of course, government is the problem. The armies of bureaucrats proliferating like Goebbels, scurrying like lemmings in pursuit of the ever-expanding federal agenda testify to that amply. Tom Jefferson, the only genius we ever had, said that government is best which governs least. I'm amazed you Democrats are still comfortable with Mr. Jefferson as your designated logo.
Thank you. Don't leave. It's the time for the negative team to ask questions of Mr. Heston, and let's just remind everybody at the beginning, both teams, questions, like on Jeopardy, the question has to be in the form of a question. Who has a question?
Well,
Ms. Schroeder.
I certainly hope that you're also going to stand strong with us and keep the federal government out of bedrooms. I know many of the people that are on your side also would like to get people into the private lives of folks. And I've always found it really amazing in that your side very often trusts corporations and fat cats to do anything, and they want them deregulated, but they want to regulate the private lives of people. I hope you clearly are against that also.
Well, as the fellow that took down the original dictation on the Ten Commandments, I'm naturally opposed to adultery.
Would you have adultery police?
I'm sorry?
Would you have federal adultery police?
No.
Someone else? Senator McGovern.
Mr. Heston, I made reference to the savings and loan crisis. This is probably the most embarrassing and expensive financial scandal, at least in the 200-year history of the country. Some people think that a major contributor to that was the breakdown of government regulation. We actually weakened the regulatory agencies, and there was a kind of an atmosphere in the country to let people do what they wanted to in the private sector. What's your assessment of how well that theory has worked in the savings and loan industry, where everybody was more or less allowed to run wild without any kind of government supervision?
I think certainly there was grievous dereliction of duty there on the part of the government, specifically in the Congress. We lost the Speaker of the House, Jim Wright. We are about to lose the senior senator from California, Alan Cranston, because of their involvements. There were certainly congressmen and senators in both parties that were involved in this, but I don't think the handling of the problem speaks well for the function of government.
But wasn't it essentially the breakdown of, as I understand your view here tonight, you would tend wherever possible to eliminate government supervision and government regulation? Obviously, we had a lot of scandalous behavior on the part of both the Congress and the executive branch. But is your argument that things would have been better in the savings and loan industry if we had had less government regulation and less government supervision?
Certainly would have been better if a little cadre in the Congress had not, in kind of a quiet meeting in the cloakroom, said, well, look, let's guarantee loans up to $100,000. That was a little careless.
Dennis Weaver, do you have a question?
No, I just wanted, Chuck, you said, you don't mind if I call you Chuck, do you?
No, Dennis.
You said that
You called me Chuck at the Screen
government
Actors Guild.
is not the solution, it's the problem. I just wonder what you would consider to be the solution in situations like the problems that we have in our inner cities, where our young people there are unemployed at a horrendous rate of like 50%, and that we have so much crime going on there because there's really no incentive for these young people. I just wonder what your solution would be.
I think you have to consider very carefully what kind of regulations must be put in place. I think there's an instinct in the Congress to pass a law, any law, and see if it flies or not. We're both Californians, or now we're Californians. As you know, we're considering a Proposition 128, which is a massive environmental control bill. Now, you can't be against controlling the environment, clean air, all that. That's like being against apple pie. But they're just starting to figure out that that bill, if passed as currently worded in this fall's election, is going to cost California taxpayers $4 billion.
Do you realize what it would cost them if it isn't passed? You know, their life supports.
Well, I think that's an example of excessive government activity without gains.
Gary Hart.
Mr. Heston, I'd like to provide 3 or 4 examples of government services and see which ones you think the government should not do. Cleaning up toxic waste dumps, protecting workers' safety on the job, delivering Social Security checks to elderly people, regulating airline services, or providing poor children the opportunity for advancement through a Head Start program.
I think a good case is the minority children who are getting insufficient housing, insufficient education. I think the government is going at it the wrong way. I think what we have to do is improve the schools, provide employment opportunities, not provide affirmative action programs that amount to mandated quotas in jobs, educational opportunities, things of that kind.
Okay. Thanks a lot, Mr. Heston. Yeah. Dennis Weaver, it's time for your opening statement, please.
This is my baptism under fire, if you will, because I've never done one of these before, and so please be kind. I think it was James Madison that said, if men were angels, no government would be necessary. And since I failed to see any sets of wings in the audience or on the panelists, I really feel that government of some form is absolutely essential. I suppose we're talking about here the government of the United States, where we have a one-person, a one-vote democratic system where we have the power as the voters and the people to direct our elected representatives so that we can shape our own destiny and our own future. And if the government isn't working as we feel that it should, we have the power to change that. In other words, we have freedom. Free to say what we want, free to write what we want, free to follow the religion of our own conscience, and free to hang out with whoever we want to hang out with. Now, that's the first responsibility of government, to secure those rights and to secure our freedom and our safety. It says in the Declaration of Independence that all men are created equal, that we are endowed with certain unalienable rights, and among those rights are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And to secure those rights, governments are instituted. Governments are instituted. Okay. I think I hear the gavel. Does that mean
but
stop?
don't stop, but don't move. Does anyone have a question for Mr. Weaver? Mrs. Kirkpatrick.
Mr. Weaver, you cited Madison, who said that if men were angels, no governments would be necessary.
That's right.
He went on to say that what is government except the greatest reflection of all on human nature?
The greatest what?
Reflection of all on human nature. This was a warning, wasn't it, of Madison to us about governments. Governments he treated really as a kind of necessary evil. And he also said, and he also said that governments must be constructed so that they may govern and also forced to govern themselves. Would you say, Mr. Weaver, that the Congress of the United States has, for example, in conjunction with the Executive Department, demonstrated a capacity to govern itself with regard to the expenditure of American tax monies?
Well, listen, if you're asking me to validate everything that the government does, you're talking to the wrong person, because I don't validate everything that the government does. But you've got to look at it on balance. Is there more good coming out of the fact that we have a government that is responsible to the people? Or is it better that we have no government whatsoever? I say that it's better that we have government. But if there is a problem, if there is a problem, the problem lies in those that are governed, because they do not accept the responsibility of a free people in a free society. Now, if those people do not accept that responsibility, I say that the freedom that they enjoy will be taken away from them.
Mr. Armey, do you have a question?
Thank you. Mr. Weaver, I understand that you're very deeply concerned with the environment. And I wonder the extent to which you have examined the impact of our current agricultural policies on the environment. I'm particularly concerned myself about the select few crops that do receive generous government subsidies and result in tendencies to monocultural cropping that in turn rely on large doses of chemical fertilizers. And I wonder if you wouldn't agree that this is a perfect example of the government interceding in the affairs of the economy unnecessarily and counterproductively to our nation's posterity.
Oh yes, I would agree with you totally that we should do everything that we can not to allow our topsoil to be poisoned, which gives us our nutritious food so that we can survive. Absolutely, and in certain cases the government oversteps its bounds. But I say to you that government, although it does do those things from time to time, you can't just say, well, hey, the bathwater is dirty, so let's throw out the baby with the bathwater. You can't just say because an engine isn't working properly that we've got to throw out the concept. Maybe the spark plugs need changing, or maybe the oil needs changing.
Mr. Buckley?
Mr. Weaver, I have a feeling that when you mentioned the term Social Security...
Did I mention that? I don't think I mentioned Social Security.
Oh, then you want to repudiate what Mr. McGovern said about it?
What did he say?
He's for it.
Well, he said that the government gave us Social Security, and under the circumstances, we should be grateful to government. But do you think that Social Security is untouchable?
What you mean by that? What do you mean untouchable? What do you mean by that?
Well, what do you mean by untouchable? I don't know.
I mean that is sacrosanct, that it can't be changed or altered in any way. Yeah. There is nothing on this world that fits that category. Everything is up for change. As a matter of fact, you can't stop it.
Wait a minute. There are lots of things that fit that category. I wouldn't want to rewrite the Moonlight Sonata, would you?
What?
What I'm asking is, I've heard people use the term Social Security as though it was the summum bonum. Now, my colleagues here are in favor of Social Security, which doesn't mean we're in favor of the Social Security program. It's been changed 13 times, i.e., it's been raised from 0.5% to about 13.5%. Is there any reason to suppose that private agencies might not have undertaken this job better?
That a private agency?
Yeah,
Social Security? They never did.
No, I say is there any reason to suppose that it couldn't have? It's like saying that
I'm here to say
private
that
mail
anything
has never taken over. The answer is it's not permitted to attempt it.
I'm saying that anything is possible, but if you look back in history, no private industry or entity ever tried to take that on because primarily they were motivated by greed.
Of course, that's not true. That's not true because pension programs existed 100 years before Social Security was even thought of.
One quick last word. Nope.
Okay.
Why don't we end it right there? Thanks very much. Mr. Armey and Ms. Schroeder. Would the two members of Congress please ascend the podium? And Mr. Armey, you go first with a brief opening remark.
Thank you. Let me begin by saying that minimal, rational, sane, compliant government with the wishes of the people, such as outlined by the 18th century liberals, is not a part of the problem. It is the solution. But excessive interventionism in the affairs and lives of individual American citizens by government as defined by 20th century liberals is the problem. And let me give you just 3 examples based on 3 items of our provisioning of our families that are critical. In food, we have agricultural policies where we pay farmers not to farm. The USDA raises artificially the price of foodstuffs while it takes over 60 million acres of agricultural product out of production, which have been replaced, of course, by foreign agricultural resources. And the upshot have been we've increased the price to American consumers, decreased the incomes of American farmers, decreased the numbers of American farmers, and exported our farmland. In shelter, in housing, we have literally rebuilt the slums of the 1960s with the United States government as the absentee slum landlord, and housing conditions have gone from bad to extremely worse. And now in clothing for our children, just this time of the year as we set forth to buying our youngster school children, those people who would champion big government in your lives are bringing forth another textile quota bill that would increase the cost of your children's clothing to protect a special interest group from those foreign competitors.
Thank you. Ms. Schroeder.
Thank you very much, Michael, and thank you all for being here. I guess my premise is strikingly similar to yours, Dick, if I may call you that, and that is the government I don't think is the problem. I think it's abuse of government that's been the problem. Unethical government has been the problem. When I think about it, throughout the years, the government's done many things we're very proud of. They've developed the polio and measles vaccine, sent people to the moon, developed sonar, radar, nuclear energy. They've And at this very moment, I think every one of us in this room has to reflect upon the fact that government employees are in our embassy in Kuwait protecting private American citizens. And I think if anyone begrudges the government for doing that, we're really off the mark. So they've been doing some fabulous things. However, the abuse of government, whether you look at the S&L mess, or whether you look at the HUD scandal, or you look at many other such things, that is very shocking. Unfortunately, in the 80s, we had many, many, many more scandals than we've ever had before. As I've looked at history, I've been amazed that conservatives from Alexander Hamilton to Winston Churchill have spoken very strongly and said that a nation is only as strong as its social fabric, and you cannot depend entirely on the market for investments that are necessary to national interests. I think we have to remember that as we talk about this tonight.
Thank you. It's your turn to question Ms. Schroeder.
Well, thank you, Pat, if I may call you that.
Sure, please. It's my name.
I, too, am a new kid on the block, and I'm just learning the protocols, Dennis, so we'll stick, if I may call you that. Obviously, since we both find aberrants, perhaps we don't agree on which is aberrant and which is not, but since we both find aberrants in government, maybe you can agree with me on Army's axiom number 1, the market's rational, the government's dumb. Now, not everybody agrees. A lot of people think it's the other way around, but I have noticed that over the last 30 years that there has been no advocate of large government. In fact, we have 3 cases in point right here.
Don't forget,
if I
it's
may
supposed to
call
be a
you
question.
that. No advocate of large government has sought and won the White House. Pat, why is it, do you think, that the American people have so clearly, out of hand, rejected these advocates of large, intrusive government as they've sought the White House in the past 30 years?
Now listen, Dick. Gary, were you advocating large government? I don't think so. I don't remember anybody standing up at a microphone and saying what this country needs is bigger, better, more government. So I don't accept your premise at all. I think that our campaigns, unfortunately, have been skewed much more by the ability to collect money. I think we've now got a coin-operated legislative machine in Washington, D.C., because I think the people with the big bucks get elected. And I think it's also been manipulated by image makers and TV and actors and all sorts of good things that have come to the forefront. So I think it's been much more that than any kind of ideological debate. And I can't remember one candidate saying, I'm better than you because I'm for bigger government.
Okay. I can remember such candidates, and I can remember the American electorate say, no, we do not agree with you. Let me ask you about another one. You are very concerned about child care needs in this country, and that puts me in mind of Army's axiom that the politics agreed is always wrapped in the language of law. Now, when we see the political polemics regarding the love of our children, we have 2 kinds of people making advocacy. So, some, like yourself, are saying it is necessary for the government to get into the child care business and to provide and dictate the terms of child care. Why wouldn't you rather see, as I would argue, that the solution would best be left in the hands of the parents, as they themselves are left with more take-home pay because of less taxes, so that they can continue to do what parents do best, which is provide the best alternative solution for the care and feeding of their children, as opposed to the big government advocates who insist that we must provide this care through government agencies and bureaus.
Well, Dick, I think the answer is that you are viewing the world as an Ozzie and Harriet world. And really, only 10% of America's families look like Ozzie and Harriet today. We're not concerned about middle-class families. We are giving them some tax benefits for child care, allowing them to go where they want, allowing corporations to put together a menu of benefits that each employee checks off, and that's perfect. That keeps the government out of it. They're allowed to do whatever they want. The real concern is, what do you do to help women who are single women get back into the workplace? Well, part of the way you get in, if you're going in at the minimum wage, is you're going to have to subsidize child care. And it's a whole lot cheaper to subsidize their child care than it is to subsidize a whole family on welfare. So you're really saving a lot of money, plus that family's regaining dignity by being able to hold their head high. In this country, people don't say, "Who are you?" They say, "What do you do?" If you say nothing, you are nothing. So when you look at the demographics of this country, I think it's very important, if we want people to get on their feet and get going, we've got to help them find affordable, quality child care. And in the long term, it's going to save you a lot of money, Dick. You're going to like my program.
Okay, excuse me, Congressman Armey, Congresswoman Schroeder, if I may call you that. It's your turn to ask questions of the congressman.
Absolutely. Well, it's hard to ask questions because I had come all prepared to ask Newt questions. And unfortunately, Dick Armey and I have kind of similar voting records on agriculture. I voted against agriculture. I voted against the textile quotas.
Pretend he's Newt Gingrich.
Go ahead
I'd
and
love
ask
to
me
have him defend. Would
Newt's
you
questions.
defend
I'll
Newt?
give you better answers.
I was going to say, I'd love to give you, I would love to give you Newt's questions, but I know how you'd answer them. You'd answer them the same way I did, so here we are. But let me say, one of the things that was mentioned is the marketplace, and people saying that we really wanted a free marketplace. You mentioned that vis-a-vis textiles. And I think you also have to admit, though, that our marketplace isn't totally free, that we bend it through all sorts of pretzel-like contortions because of the tax code. My question is, should we change the tax code so it's totally neutral and we really do have a marketplace that's dictated by the market and not by artificially driven tax shelters and other such things?
Well, the neutrality of the tax code is by and large a good idea. On the other hand, it can be used as a method by which you could define and enforce property rights to deal with such problems of economic externalities such as pollution. A proper response to the existence of pollution by a series of flexible variable taxes imposed by government that in effect price the use of this natural resource would provide a disincentive to abusive use of the resources, and that kind of non-neutrality in the tax code could be productive in enabling a rational government in fulfilling its legitimate function, which is, of course, to provide for the natural security of the nation's natural resources. Unhappily, we don't use the code that productively. We use it more often, too often, for presumed egalitarian purposes and not purposes of greater economic efficiency.
Let me ask another question, too. I'm going to let you defend your state. Because as you know, in Washington, there's starting to be a real backlash about Texas. They're saying too much of our taxes go to Texas. And they're looking at the S&L bailout, the highway system, all sorts of things. Texas is big, and Texas gets a big chunk out of that budget. How do you defend that as a fiscal conservative?
Well, first of all, I don't defend Texas, and I am very understanding about anybody who neither had the good fortune to be born a Texan or the good sense to move to Texas, feeling a little bit envious about those of us that had one or the other. We in Texas who measure these things. As we measure these things, we don't believe that we're getting ahead of the game in terms of all the money. We feel like we pay more than a fair share of taxes to the federal government, and we rarely see any fair return on our dollar. After the rake is taken in Washington, we get little enough back for our hard-earned dollars. So we really, frankly, do not pay a great deal of credence to this allegation as it comes from other people.
Well, there's a lot of economists who put a different number on it, but it's very interesting. Let me ask you the question I was talking about, both from Alexander Hamilton to Winston Churchill. They've all mused about the fact that it's very difficult to get the marketplace to invest in a lot of things needed in a society to make it work, such as roads and things of that order. Do you agree with that, or is there anything that you think in our society that we may have to do through the government that it's hard to get the
No, there's no doubt about it. In fact, after you read Adam Smith, and I do read Adam Smith religiously, he made the point that it is a legitimate and necessary function of government to build infrastructure. The question is always, how far do you go in the building of infrastructure? But I remember the great debate of the 1960s, as all the liberals that I went to graduate school with were hearkening on to the Great Society. And I advised and warned, listen, if we take that big a portion of our budget and we put it into these income redistributive programs that have been total failures, quite frankly, the poverty level is the same as it was then, we would not sustain our infrastructure, and that's been the disaster of the Great Society.
Thank you, congresspersons. Ambassador Kirkpatrick. Ambassador Kirkpatrick.
I think it's perfectly clear that we are, as at the time of the founding, a blessed country. We are not confronting a choice between anarchy and totalitarianism. We are confronting, however, a choice on an almost daily, weekly, monthly, and yearly basis between strengthening our civil society and permitting it to direct our lives, and strengthening government bureaucracy. We're confronting a choice about whether or not to live our lives as we as free individuals desire to, or whether we live our lives directed by an ever more powerful government. It is simply a fact that there is a tendency in our century and in our country to more government. There's a tendency to solve problems, more problems, at the national level than at the local level, at the official level than at the unofficial level. There's a tendency to transfer power over the lives of individuals and our communities and our businesses and our families and our country from individuals to government. That's a negative tendency, and it should be opposed. Democrats mainly support that tendency.
Does anyone have a question for Mr. Kirkpatrick, please? Senator Hart.
Ambassador Kirkpatrick, the proposition before us is that government is bad. In your conception of that, does that also include state and local governments? For as you know, the size in terms of employees of the national government has stayed roughly the same over the past quarter century, whereas state and local governments have doubled or tripled. So does your opposition to government also include state and local governments?
Well, you know, actually, I don't think of myself as opposing government. I think of myself as supporting government. I think of myself as opposing the inappropriate and undue extension of government power at all levels, local, state, and federal. And I think that it is very important to be aware of the growth of state governments and the burgeoning powers of state governments as well as federal government. I believe, in fact, that local governments are likely to be least oppressive. I think the principle of subsidiarity is sound here, that the closer to the individual and the individual's problems a solution can be found, the better. And if there is a problem for which it is really necessary to turn to government, then I think that the government should be the lowest possible level of government. The neighborhood is preferable to the city to the state.
Anyone, Dennis Weaver, do you have a question?
You say you're not opposed to government, and I applaud that. It's really a question of how far does the government go? How far does the government interfere in private life? And that seems to be the big question here. And if we could just answer that, I think we'd make some progress. But it's curious to me that in the last 8 years, or 9 years, or since Mr. Reagan went into office, of course, he was for reducing government and hopefully improving the lot of the people, lifting the quality of the lives of the citizens. But I just, when I think of the people that I have been in contact with, for instance, the farmers of this country and the people in the inner city and the people that we help feed through a life program that I happen to be president of in Los Angeles, those people, those roles for more help are growing. They haven't decreased. And I just wonder, why do you think that is, with the less emphasis on government controls?
Well, actually, Mr. Weaver, I don't really think we've had less emphasis on government controls or less government. I think we all know that government has continued to grow. And unfortunately, it continued to grow right through the last decade. In spite of the earnest efforts of President Ronald Reagan, it continued to grow. The tendency for the growth of government is very powerful, and we have branches of government which push that very hard. We have the Congress, for example, and we have the Supreme Court. And both have, in recent years, been partisans of big government and made decisions supporting big government. And it is simply a fact that no one in our times has succeeded in reversing the trend toward the ever greater concentration of power over our lives in government. And that is why the problem is very serious and needs to be addressed by all of us.
Mr. McGovern.
Ambassador Kirkpatrick, I think one thing all 8 of us would agree on is that we don't want any more government than is necessary. The problem is, how do you define that, what is necessary? And that, I'm wondering, just to try to shed some light on this, would you argue that the Reagan approach was about right?
Well, the Reagan approach to what, Mr.
In terms of the role of government in our lives, the business about getting Uncle Sam off our backs and establishing a free market and all that sort of thing. Was that, laying aside the language, was the objective of reducing the role of government at every level, except in the Defense Department? Is that about what you folks are talking about when you say that you'd like to get away from government as the solution to our problems? What do you have in mind?
Senator McGovern, I believe that as an objective, that's a wholly worthy objective. And as an effort which President Reagan worked on very hard and very persistently, it was a worthy effort. I've already said that I don't think as a policy it was not that successful.
Okay, thank you very much. Senator Hart.
Unfortunately, debates of this kind foster a black and white view of democracy that is simple, appealing, and mostly wrong. I'd like to suggest, if I may, half dozen propositions that reflect reality and I think reflect on what Congressman Armey has called rational government. First of all, mismanagement and incompetence and abuse of power do not know partisanship or ideology. They have occurred as often under conservative administrations as under liberal ones. Second, the size of our government is determined by a moderate consensus of the American people, not extremes of the left or the right. Third, everyone wants the government to do something, either oppose communism or help the poor. The issue is what government should do. Fourth, the vast majority of people want more and better government services and want to pay less for them. 5, a big military establishment is not forced on us by a willful band of conservatives, and a human resource set of programs is not forced on us by a willful band of liberals. Responsible government will come to this country when we have leaders who are courageous enough to tell us that we have to pay for the government services that a majority of Americans clearly want.
Thank you. Does anyone have a question? Mr. Heston.
Senator, I think what we're perhaps involved in here is a question of definition of terms, as you suggested. No one here suggests there should be no government, obviously. What we are concerned with, what I am concerned about, is the coercive, increasingly coercive pressures of government to require people to behave in a certain way and suffer penalties if they don't. Congresswoman Schroeder, if I may call you that, was suggesting a sweeping federal child care bill, which will, while you say, well, this is going to get the kids taken care of during the day while their mothers and fathers are working, it will also surrender a whole generation of children to bureaucratic care. I'm not happy with that. Are you happy with that?
Not at all, and I don't think that's what Congresswoman Schroeder has advocated, nor indeed the political party to which I belong. There were lots of arguments, as I recall reading the history, back to the Social Security program, other social programs of that sort under both Franklin Roosevelt and, for that matter, Lyndon Johnson, that all these programs would involve the government getting into people's lives. Some did, some didn't. I don't think the majority of senior citizens in this country think the Social Security program's involved in their lives, at least to the extent they want to get rid of it. Now, I know we keep coming back to that program, and people don't particularly like to because it does have broad-based public support, but it is an instance where the government, if you will, acting on behalf of a majority of the people of this country, instituted a security program for the seniors of this country which they didn't have before, and it has not been intrusive by and large on their lives. It's certainly not to the extent they want to get rid of it. So I think it is possible, and again, I think maybe the key word in this debate this evening is Congressman Armey's phrase about rational government. The issue is, can a program be fashioned to solve a real social or human need without that kind of bureaucratic interference? That is the challenge.
Mr. Buckley.
Senator, you're a very bright guy, and I just wonder why you aren't prepared to make certain concessions which are progressively being made throughout the civilized world by people who have had an inordinate experience with big government. I mean privatization. In Great Britain, they have been privatizing now for 4 or 5 years, in each case with considerable success. In France, they've been doing that. If you like, I can give you examples from Fort Worth, from Buffalo, from Los Angeles, from Scottsdale, from Auburn, Alabama, but I won't tax you by feeding you data which point in a direction you can't easily anticipate. Are you prepared to say that if we can establish that a particular function can be better performed by the private sector, you would gladly unburden government of that responsibility?
Absolutely.
Okay, terrific. Now, under the circumstances, can you tell me what the
Not only
case is?
can be performed, but will be performed.
Well, can you tell me, for instance, why it was that Mr. Trump was able in 5 months, spending $3 million to build a skating rink, which the city of New York had spent $12 million over a period of 7 years and hadn't completed? Now, does that tell you something about governments?
Yes, it tells me a great deal, but I also would want to remind you, as I'm sure you know, being a bright guy, that that our principal industrial and democratic competitors in the world today are Germany and Japan. Now, government in those two countries, where I don't think democracy is in danger, at least the last I heard, play a much greater role in industry, in commerce, in the economy, presumably in people's lives, therefore, than government in the United States. What do you think about that?
Well, the answer to that, at least the easiest answer to that, is that beginning when Mr. Reagan became President of the United States, for the succeeding 8 years, we had a 20 million increase in employment while Germany had none. Okay. And in respect of Japan, our workers can in 31 minutes create what it takes them 60 minutes to create.
Can you ask a question in about 20 seconds, Mr.
About
Armey?
Japan, and they're rather clever people in all aspects.
Well, I would just add to that one fact that hasn't been made, pointed out here tonight, reiterate it again, that as Congressman Armey said, the people have been voting for candidates that they perceive are going to bring them less government. And we blame the Congress, the perfidious Congress, for denying the people less government, but That Congress, at least 6 years of it, when President Reagan was in office, one house of the Congress belonged to the Republican Party. Thank you very much.
Mr. Buckley, if I may call you that. It's time to submit to the examination by the negative team. Here's your chance to hit the boss. Who's got a question? Senator McGovern.
We start right in, or does he get a chance?
No, he's had enough.
Oh, well,
Go ahead.
Bill, I was a little startled here a moment ago when you cited the inefficiency of the city of New York in building a skating rink, and then held up Donald Trump as your model of how the free enterprise ought to work.
You and I are both students of rhetoric, and you therefore won't mind my saying that I didn't hold him up as my model. I held him up as a comparison.
I see. Because my impression was that my impression is that, like the Stratford Inn, he's almost in as much trouble as the city of New York. But I don't want to push that any
Yeah, but the
further.
skating rink's doing all right.
Yes, that.
Ms. Schroeder.
I want to say I enjoyed your opening statement, and I want a clarification too. I thought I was listening intently, and you made some comment about the SNL crisis happening because we weren't watching carefully enough. Were you really advocating more regulation?
No, what I said was that
worried.
the guarantees caused the difficulty because they were made without binding reference to what it was they were guaranteeing. If you want there would have been no SNL crisis in any administration which I was in charge of. I think Milton Friedman is exactly correct and has been for 20 years since he said there should be two kinds of banks. In one kind of a bank, you get a 100% guarantee no matter how much you put into it. But it has to invest in government paper. The other bank can do anything it wants to, and it gets no guarantees. That's the way it ought to be. And if insurance companies want to step forward and guarantee bank number 2, let them go ahead and do it.
Okay, Senator Hart.
Let me try one more time, Mr. Buckley, at the last proposition.
What do you mean, the first time didn't work?
That has happened in your case before. Why is it that President Reagan, with the support for 6 years of a Republican Senate, was not able to destroy many of these programs that your side is saying
Because the Republican
bad?
Party is contaminated. We're talking about government, whether it's run by Democrats or Republicans. We're better than you are, but we're not by any means pure.
Mr. Weaver, do you have a question?
My hero, Jesse Helms, votes for subsidized tobacco. How do you justify that? Did you vote for subsidies for tobacco? Did you vote for subsidies for tobacco?
Phased out, actually.
What does that mean?
Mr.
That
Weaver,
means reduced and eliminated.
do you have a very brief question for Mr. Buckley?
Not a very good one, but you know,
brief
that's the
is
best I can do.
Just a characteristic one, Mr. Weaver.
You know, you want, your emphasis is on freedom. Freedom to do what we, as long as it doesn't interfere with other person's freedom.
It usually is, but it wasn't tonight. Tonight I'm talking about what the problem is. The problem is government.
Well, isn't that involved with a freedom to move?
But also
and do
efficiency.
As far as
the skating rink
contingency is
isn't really an
concerned?
aspect of freedom.
What's that?
The skating rink that was built by the private sector isn't an aspect really of freedom.
Well,
it's an
now
aspect
you
of
see,
efficiency.
we've flittered away all this time. I have no time for the question.
Well,
You're
it's been very enlightening from
astute.
both of you. Thanks a lot. George McGovern. Does anyone have a question for Senator McGovern? Mr. Armey.
Well, let me just, we've talked a lot about the Republican-controlled Senate without ever mentioning that it's the least effective of the two bodies. The real heavy lifting is always done in the House where the big guys work. But let me ask you, Senator, you spent a good deal of time in the Senate. Can you name any 3 non-defense programs that you think we could afford to do without in this country?
Well, Bill
federal
Buckley
government
mentioned one here, the subsidizing tobacco. I think in view of what we know about that, we don't want to put federal funds into that program anymore. I would say that almost every part of the government, there can be some tightening up. I can't think of any department I would exempt from some tightening up. I think that all the agencies of the government could undergo closer oversight by the Congress and by the executive branch.
Moses, if I may call you that.
Senator, I think what we're talking about here, at least what concerns me, is things that seem like a good idea at the time, like the child care bill, if you will. Then they gradually degenerate and become distorted from their original purpose. What I have in mind is the civil rights legislation of '65. You were in the Senate then.
Right.
One of the proudest moments of my life was the time I spent demonstrating on that, marching behind Dr. King with Roy Innes and those good guys. And the march in Washington, for which I led the arts contingent, was really was a proud day. You were there too, I'm sure. I was also there in the Senate, in the gallery, when they were debating the bill in, January?
Can we have a question?
Yes, yes. And they were saying, now, there's not going to be affirmative action here. There's no quotas in this. And Hubert Humphrey said, this bill is 23 pages long. If you can find anything in it that mentions affirmative action or quotas, I will eat the bill on the floor of the Senate. You may have been there that
Yes,
day.
I was there.
And I'm sure he meant it. He was a fine man. Now, we have gotten past affirmative action to dictated quotas on employment, housing, education, almost everything you can think of. Do you approve of that as a federal program?
Let me say that I heard Senator Humphrey say that, and there's probably no more consistent advocate of human rights and civil rights than Hubert Humphrey. I think all of us have been uncomfortable from the beginning legislating affirmative action, but it was essential under the conditions. I frankly don't know what was in Senator Humphrey's mind that day when he said we never could consider that route, but we had some 300 years of slavery, the effects of which are still with us, that had to be overcome. So I think, first of all, on balance, the civil rights legislation that began in the 50s and the 60s and has continued on down to the present day is one of the great victories of American government. This isn't something we should apologize for. The pride that you felt the day you were there, I think, was justified. It's possible that in some of these areas we need to take another look at what we're doing in the field of civil rights because of practical considerations and what we've learned with it. But on balance, civil rights is one of those things that every American ought to stand for, and is one of the reasons why we ought to be proud of being Americans and be proud that we have the kind of a government we do.
Thank you. Actually, Mr. Heston, you're going to ascend the podium and continue your dialogue with Senator McGovern.
I'm sorry?
It's your turn, as I read this program, to ascend the podium and continue your dialogue.
I'm supposed to come up here, shouldn't I?
Yeah, go right ahead. Well, Mr. Heston goes first, coming up here and continue your interrogation of the senator.
Interrogate each other, I guess,
Yes.
now. This is an honest question about changing opinions. When I came back from the war we attended together, we all shared a feeling that democracy had won, the good guys had won. Then, in my perception, the Democratic Party, after Jack Kennedy, started moving to the left. For me, it was like St. Paul on the road to Damascus, when I suddenly thought, when Goldwater says, in your heart you know he's right, and by God, he is. Now, you had the same values, went through the same experience. Are you comfortable with the Democratic Party as it is now as compared to in the days of Jack Kennedy when Adlai Stevenson was running, for example?
I understand you were comfortable with
I was,
John
yes,
Kennedy.
yes,
And,
yes.
I
The last president that could say to a Democratic audience, I will go anywhere, bear any burden, pay any price.
Did the
defensive.
problems begin with McGovern? Is that what you're getting at here? Well, let me say this.
No, they began with
I
Johnson.
thought that Senator Hart made a good point that this country more or less operates with a moderate consensus. I don't think the Democratic Party is dominated by left-wingers. Some of the people that generally are thought to be further to the left haven't been in power for a long, long time, and yet this subject is considered pertinent tonight by you folks on that side of the aisle. You somehow detect a kind of a general drift to the left in this country and too much government action, yet we've had now a decade of Reagan and Bush, preceded by almost a decade of Nixon and Ford. So it's not really the left wing of the Democratic Party that's been dominating America over the last 20 years. I personally would like to see the Democrats speak out more forcefully than they are, for example, on the environment. You yourself said, Mr. Heston, and I applaud you for this, that your objection to government doesn't extend to the environment. You think we have to have government regulation in that area. And I agree with that. I would like to see both parties recognize that this environmental challenge may have become a greater threat to our survival even than the likelihood of a nuclear war. I think the nuclear danger is subsiding at the very time the environmental crisis threatens us. So I cite that simply because it's one illustration of where I would like to see the Democrats be more active, more forceful, more positive even than they were in the days of John Kennedy and Adlai Stevenson.
I would point out to you what Congressman Armey said, that there are actions taken, for instance, in the farm support bills that actually are as seriously damaging to the environment as oil spills.
Well, keep in mind, in this country, the Farm Bill, as the Congressman knows, is a result of a bipartisan bloc, of which I've been one of the parts for a long time. I think basically we do have to have a federal farm program. I don't think we can operate without it. But let me just go back to this larger question that you have raised about whether the Democrats have moved too far to the left. When I look
I
at
said just out from under me, that's all I said.
Well, but when you look at, for example, the performance of both parties on this S&L scandal that I mentioned here a while ago, this is a calamitous development in this country, and it's really a failure of both parties. It's true that the Congress should not have provided a $100,000 guarantee and then removed all the regulations. But keep in mind that bill was signed into law by President Reagan. It was a bipartisan measure. I personally would like to see conservatives be conservatives and Democrats be liberals. I think that's when our system works the best. And I would just say this to you, Mr. Heston, I can't think of any positive program now generally supported by you and by me and by most Americans of both parties that did not begin as a liberal initiative over conservative opposition. So we need a liberal movement in this country.
What about the U.S. Mint?
Answer that very briefly and then go on the offensive.
Well, I'm just saying I can't think of any positive program. I'm thinking about things like Social Security and Medicare and REA and guaranteed bank deposits, all these things, collective bargaining, and you're an important part of that. All of this began as the result of positive, affirmative, progressive government. And then after a period of time, the conservatives decided maybe it was working pretty well, and they latched onto it. Keep in mind that even President Reagan said that the one thing that he regarded as untouchable, if I can use Bill's phrase, is Social Security. He said, I'll compromise on other things, but you're not going to touch Social Security, even to get the budget in balance. So the point I'm trying to make is that we have a lot of strong programs in this country. They can all be improved, every one of them. But as Dennis Weaver said, we don't want to throw the baby out with the bath. We don't want a revolution against government that undercuts our support for programs that are in the public interest.
Now ask a question.
All right. I had a couple of questions that I wanted to address to you. I think there's probably a general agreement on your side of the debate here tonight that the Reagan people were at least trying to accomplish what you wanted in government. It strikes me, though, that some of the most serious abuses that we're now living with, let's lay aside the S&L crisis, which was a bipartisan matter, began in that Reagan period. For example, the Environmental Protection Agency was loaded by federal appointments on the part of President Reagan who didn't believe in environmental protection. They didn't share your view that the environment needs to be protected. Some of those people were so corrupt they were sent off to jail after a period of time. The housing agency of the government is supposed to provide moderate-priced housing for low and moderate income people was filled up with thieves in the Reagan period.
Is the question, does he approve of that?
The question is, wasn't there, or isn't there the danger in the kind of thing we're talking about here tonight of a kind of a contempt developing for government that carries over to the point where if you follow that philosophy too far, you don't really seek out the best people. You don't really seek out the public interest because, frankly, you don't really care to see government function in a strong and effective way.
I certainly believe in intelligent, fair-minded legislators. I object very much to, for example, when the Supreme Court 17 months ago, with the Beck decision, passed a ruling that sharply reduced the power of the AFL-CIO. Now, I think we could all agree that the power of the labor unions is excessive. And it was sharply...
Well, I don't agree with that.
Well,
I think they've been in decline for the last 25 years.
But there is a bill in both houses of Congress now to overturn the Supreme Court decision in that area and restore to the AFL-CIO their former sweeping, draconian, punitive powers. I belong to 4 unions. I just accepted financial core membership in Actors' Equity over the Miss Saigon scandal.
Let me put another question to you.
So this is important to me personally.
Let me put another question to you, Mr. Heston. There's no question that all of us have detected a growing skepticism about government on the part of increasing numbers of Americans. Do you think that one possible reason for that is our tax code? Now, over the last 10 years, the impression was given by the Reagan leadership, and even by the Congress, I regret to say, that we were getting a tax cut in the 1980s. But what Americans have discovered is that except for the top 10%, most Americans now pay higher taxes to the federal government than they did 10 years ago. Do you suspect that maybe that kind of manipulation and betrayal of the rhetoric is responsible for some of this skepticism about government?
I suspect that perhaps the statistics are slightly skewed, not by you in that, but I think Congressman Armey would support my contention that not all taxes have gone up for the poor and down for the...
Well, I'm talking about primarily the middle class here. I think the middle class is the group in this country that's been taken for a ride by tax
class in the
policy.
group in this country that is usually taken for a
well,
ride.
that's one of the problems. It's why a lot of people, I think, are skeptical about both parties. But we were told that we were going to get a broad tax cut in the 1980s. I believe Senator Hart voted against it, possibly for this reason. It wasn't a fair tax. It helped the super rich at the top, but it didn't help the people in the middle.
Thank you both. Thank you both. Congressman Armey. Someone on the negative team have a question for the congressman?
Sure.
Pat Schroeder.
Well, I'm really appreciative of the fact that you're here tonight on short order, and I know that you're replacing Newt Gingrich, who was at the budget summit. I guess I'm asking more a news question than anything else. Do you think we're going to get one this year? I find it will be devastating if we don't. And what are you hearing on your side? What are we talking about giving up to
You can tell us off the record.
Well, I have no inside dope, and there's no pun intended, by the way. We will get a summit agreement, and like every summit agreement that I know of, it will overestimate the budget savings when in fact it is enforced. It will prove to have underestimated the tax bill to the American people when it is, and it will prove to have overestimated its impact on the deficit. It will most likely be the wrong package to achieve the most dynamic results we want for our children, and precisely for that reason will most likely be the package that is most actively supported by the majority of Congress.
Does someone have a slightly tougher question? Mr. Hart.
Congressman, Mr. Buckley earlier said very shocking thing, something he almost never does. He said the Republican Party had been contaminated, presumably by whatever disease he perceives the Democrats to have. Do you agree with that, and if so, why?
Well, one of the things that I like to point out to my children, who I'm trying to raise properly, is that two things. One, politics is the great compromiser, and sooner or later, politics will make a fool out of everybody. And of course, Republicans do politics too, like Democrats. We don't do it as well, but we do politics. And it's very hard for anybody to do politics without getting contaminated. Sooner or later, you got to reach down in that old pork barrel for somebody. And Republicans, unhappily, have not been above doing that universally. I try to keep away from it the best I can. I hope I'm successful. And the fact that I am totally devoid of political ambition, I think, is my greatest insulating asset.
Mr. Weaver.
Well, you know what I'm impressed by, and this is my first debate. I didn't even belong to a debating society in high school, so I'm learning a lot. But it seems to me that we are very close to agreeing with each other. You see, it's just a question of degree, just politeness. You were always very polite, Chuck. But it seems to me that it is time to quit labeling people like you're an ultra-left, or you're a liberal, or you're a conservative, or you're this, that, or which is only inflammatory. And I really don't know what liberal means anyway. People keep calling me a liberal. I read it in the paper today. It says there's this liberal actor coming to Hillsdale. I don't know what it meant. But shouldn't we be putting those things aside and in a effort of cooperation to address the issues and quit getting knee-jerk reactions from these labels that we give each other?
No, I agree, and I think we should be more good-natured about it. I was telling a liberal friend of mine just the other day that we were fundamentally the same. I said, you and I are fundamentally the same. I spend that money like it's my money, and you spend that money like it's my money.
Senator McGovern. Mr. McGovern. Brief question.
Congressman, one of the big problems we haven't talked about here tonight is the deterioration of the physical facilities of the country, the bridges and roadways and railways and all those things. Those are basically public properties. Do you see any way to really rebuild the physical infrastructure of the country except by more vigorous government action than we now have?
No, it's very hard. Of course, as you know, the public highway is the classic definition of the public good, even given by such economists as Arthur Cecil Pigou, very much the conservative economist. And the fact is, it is necessary for government to perform that role. Now, my problem with that is, as the government, for by and large political reasons, taught to us by Lyndon Johnson in the 60s, moved off in different directions of doing what it couldn't do and doing it well, it neglected that task. We've got to get back to that task and do it properly.
Congresswoman Schroeder. We haven't heard from Jeane Kirkpatrick for a while. Do you have a question for Ms. Schroeder?
Yes, I have a question for Ms. Schroeder. Pat, I think that what bothers me the most about government is its inefficiency. The real problem with government, if it is not about to establish a tyranny, as our government is not, certainly not in the immediate future, is the waste and inefficiency involved, and the tendency of government programs to enrich those who advocated the programs. It is said, for example, that of the New York City's $14.8 billion welfare budget, 68% goes to the social service workers, two-thirds, that is, not to the poor. Now, what do you propose to do about this well-known failure of big government?
I'll tell you what
At all levels.
I'll tell you what I have proposed to do, and I was very sorry I couldn't sell it to Republican administrations. I looked at what they did in Japan and what they've done in other countries where their government has been more efficient. And let me tell you what they do. They give money to an agency at the beginning of the year to run the agency. At the end of the year, if there is money left over, then half the money is returned to the Treasury, half the money is kept within the agency to pay out incentives, get more efficient equipment, or whatever. So for the first time, you have taken government incentives and flipped them. So the incentive is to be efficient, not to be inefficient. You know, because you've been in government, that the problem is you've got to spend your budget or you may not get the same budget next year, and those last few months you see often very wasteful projects go on. It's ridiculous.
New York City welfare workers have a hard time spending their budget?
No, I think that if you found a way to put an incentive in, and this is how other countries have done it. I did intensive hearings. In fact, we had people from Georgetown explaining to us how other countries ran their bureaucracies that were running them much more efficiently. I think that rebuilds the trust, that holds them accountable, and they see a way they win to get the numbers down, and everybody wins.
Mr.
And
Buckley.
I think that's where we ought to go.
Mr. Buckley.
Mrs. Schroeder, let's dispose, shall we, of the whole business about the environment, because all of us agree with Adam Smith that it is a common property, and it ought to be protected even as private property is protected. But we do think this, that the tendency of government, especially when liberals are in charge, is to engage in the sin of what the medievalists used to call scrupulosity. Are you aware of that term?
Oh, it's a wonderful word.
Define it for
Well,
us very
apart from
briefly.
being a wonderful word, are you aware of it?
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
Oh, yes.
Well,
We know a
this-
few
this-
big words in Colorado.
The sin of scrupulosity. It's not all that long, but what it betokened in the Middle Ages was somebody who was so afraid of dirt, for instance, that he or she would insist on washing himself 35 times, lest there be that slight stain. Now, I think the sin of scrupulosity is affecting the position towards the environment of you types. And my best evidence of that is that there is not a nuclear energy program in this country, which is a sheer Luddite extravagance. 10% of our electricity is a result of nuclear energy. 75% of France's is a result of nuclear energy. And it's people like you and Jane Fonda who make this possible.
Well, pretend that was a question.
Let me say, first of all, I'm delighted to see you've joined the Green Party. I mean, I love that you're now declaring that the environment is part of the common good. That's kind of the definition. I've never thought of Buckley as a Green, but we're glad to see your colors.
Why
Maybe
treat
it's
that
because
as
of the Irish
current
background.
news, since I've been defending the environment as long as I can remember?
Well, I think that's wonderful. But let me respond
think
to
it's
your
wonderful, why did you
question
bring it up?
about the nuclear reactor. Let me say that we also have canceled solar, the whole SERI program, the Solar Energy Research Program, and those incentives. So has geothermal in Iceland. They heat every home for $5 a year with geothermal. We have geothermal programs going up, coal gasification, all sorts of energy independent programs were killed by not Jane Fonda, but they were killed by Ronald Reagan.
All right.
Now, the nuclear program.
Now, boys and girls.
Say you don't choose to answer my question.
Stop it.
I think he's upset.
No, wait a minute. Say you don't choose to answer my question. It'll save a lot of time.
right.
We don't have to talk about Alaska
I'm explaining
or
that there
Iceland
are
that way.
many other alternative energy forms, and part of the reason
Ms.
nuclear
Schroeder.
hasn't made it is that the corporations never came up with one reactor.
You're both
perfected.
behaving very badly. Mr. Buckley, come on up here. Mr. Weaver. Mr. Weaver, come on up and ask some questions of Mr. Buckley. Oh, no, Mr. Buckley goes first. Ask questions of you.
Am I supposed to come up?
I'm afraid so, yes. This will be painless.
Remember that phrase, he was led to the slaughter? Okay. Just be
Buckley.
kind.
Mr. Weaver, we've tried to establish here that government is the problem. Now, we don't mean by saying that there aren't other problems, because there always will be other problems unless somebody, perhaps the Democratic platform of 1998, comes up with some way of repealing original sin. But that government is a problem, is something that strikes us as manifest. Now, let me ask you this. We know that in New York City, as in most of the country, in the public schools, the ratings achieved by graduating students are lowering year after year. And this is not apparently an aspect of dollars spent per student, because the dollars spent per student are rising at a geometric rate. Now, by contrast, we see, for instance, in New York City, the parochial schools spending $2,000 per student, 78% of whose graduates go on to college, 78% of those who go to the public schools never finish. Now, isn't this a suggestion to you that some other device ought to be experimented with for teaching?
Well, it's just a suggestion to me that we ought to look further than just, is the problem government support and government dollars? Perhaps we should look to the background of the students that are attending those schools and what kind of homes they come from.
Well, if you want to look at, I'll tell you the background. Because I have in mind a particular school in New York.
I'm sorry, I didn't understand you.
I say I have in mind a particular school in New York which takes students only on one condition, that is that they come from a single-parent household, and that they be neither morons nor geniuses, so that in that sense they are exact duplicates of their counterparts in public schools. And yet the success
You don't really believe
ratio
that, do you?
Excuse me?
You don't really believe that, do you? That
I know
they're
it.
exact duplicates? You can't find any one thing in this whole universe that is exactly the same as some other one thing. There are always variables.
I can't see that much difference between you four.
Can't see what? I need an interpreter.
Mr. Weaver, I know that nobody has the same fingerprint as anybody else.
True, that's what I was
If you want to
referring
make that axiomatic point, I yield it to you. But I'm saying to the extent that these things are measurable, these people are identical. And I hope you don't feel that it's part of your burden to defend the record of the public schools during the past century, because they're getting worse and worse. And I want to know why you don't get up and say, well, for heaven's sakes, let's get the private sector to have a chance by having the voucher system.
I would agree with you that the education in this country is in a crisis. And we really must examine that, because I think that the most devastating problem that we have is ignorance. And if we could just take the ignorance out of our society,
that's what we're trying to do.
We would solve some of our problems. And of course, we need an educational system to do that. But you know, government, as far as money funded for educational purposes, has decreased in many areas. Over the last 20 years, for instance, federal investments in university research facilities has dropped 95%.
Research is not education. Research is research.
Research
I'm talking
is
about teaching students.
Okay.
research is linked to it.
Mr. Weaver, you can go on the offensive now and ask questions of Mr. Buckley.
Well, I never get
Make them-
offensive.
Well, make them as tough as you can without getting offensive.
Okay. You know, one of the things that has always bothered me is the amount of taxes we pay. And I think that bothers the people on your side, if I can say on your side. But it's not so much the taxes we pay that bothers me, it's what we use it for, what we pay for with that taxes. And one of the things that has bothered me, and I think it's a question of priorities, is we have spent more than we should on our defense budget. Now, I don't know if that is a problem with you or not.
Well, now,
do you feel that our defense budget has been too large?
Excuse me, how do you know it's more than we should?
I said this is my feeling.
Well,
Am I not allowed
but
my
your
feeling?
feeling is not an adequate substitute for 500 Russian divisions in my reckonings.
My feeling is not what?
Is not a substitute for 500 Russian divisions.
Please, I can't understand him even when you don't clap. You know, I read a book.
The Soviet Union disposes right now of 400 million times the potency of the bomb that fell over Hiroshima. So I'm saying if you want an 11-foot pole, get an 11-foot pole, rather than try to settle for a 10-foot pole. If you're saying that you're brainier about how to have deterred the Soviet Union when they were a spectacular menace, all I can say is maybe you got into the wrong profession.
No, well, maybe I did. A lot of people have told me that.
I don't think so.
You know, I read a book, an interesting book the other day. It was called New Realities by Peter Drucker. Have you read that book?
No.
You would enjoy that book. He says that the first economic priority must be to reduce and bring under control the defense spending and the diversion of high-grade human resources into economically unproductive, indeed economically counterproductive defense work.
Was that written before Iraq?
Oh, yes. That was certainly was written before Iraq.
And how would you materialize the strength necessary to arrest Saddam Hussein if we had not had an adequate military?
I think, well, personally, I would much rather see a united force coming from the United Nations and directed by the United Nations, which would make a greater impression upon this man and what he's doing than for us to continue to be the
With
kind
apologies
of...
to Mrs. Kirkpatrick, I want to see nothing directed by the United Nations.
Yes, well, of course, I understand your position, but I feel that it would be much more effective if it was the affairs of the United Nations rather
When
than
last
one
was
major
anything
company.
directed by the United Nations effective?
What's that? Oh, there's a lot of things that have been, for instance, the effort to save the environment, which you keep talking about.
I thought you said it wasn't effective.
No, you said
you've
what?
been caterwauling about that all night.
Maybe I misunderstood you again. What was your question?
Mr. Weaver, let me just simply say this. If we had left it to the United Nations to mobilize a force to stop Saddam Hussein, the Saudi Arabians would be living in Monaco right now, and you'd be paying $50 a gallon for oil.
But we wouldn't be in danger of having an international, absolute world catastrophe of another confrontation with atom bombs and all of those kinds of things.
I will give you 1,000,000 to 1 odds that you are not in danger of nuclear warfare at this point.
Oh, I hate to take your...
That's all right. I'll risk it.
I think we'll stop right there. Thank you, gentlemen. Mrs. Kirkpatrick and Mr. Hart, please ascend the podium. And, well, who wants to go first? Why doesn't Mrs. Kirkpatrick ask questions of Mr. Hart first?
All right. I'd like to pursue the question of of waste and inefficiency, and government as an instrument for doing things positively rather than simply controlling. Do you believe, Senator Hart, that there is any relationship between the efforts of between the utter failure of the economies and societies of Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union and the size of their government, the fact that they attempted to direct everything from the government?
Absolutely, absolutely.
Then
That's why I'm against it here.
Right. Then, Senator Hart, could you tell me how you decide how much government is enough government when you propose programs to expand the powers of government?
I think ideally both parties and political leaders in both parties would carry out a function which is not done very often in this society these days, and that is present the problem to the American people, present all the facts to the American people, whether it has to do with daycare, child care, the environment, nuclear weapons, or whatever, and seek a public debate on the matter, let members of Congress hear from the public, and then reach some public consensus based on those facts. I hate to be too philosophical here, but I think too much of the debate about the public welfare, broadly defined, has been carried out in the halls of Congress and in the White House and not in the communities like this.
Senator Hart, actually, I believe from my readings that a great many Americans, a majority of Americans even, have developed a very negative view of the expansion of government, and actually they've developed a negative view of liberals and of what's called liberal programs and people called liberals, and that's why they don't vote for people that are called liberals when the people are clearly labeled as liberals. And it's actually why the liberals today try continuously, as I think your team has this evening, to minimize the differences between liberals and conservatives and Republicans and Democrats.
No, we just don't accept the labeling.
Hart?
No, we just don't accept the labeling because it comes out of Madison Avenue or paid for with a lot of campaign dollars. I refuse, or refused when I was in public office, to abide by a category just because somebody on the opposition side tried to put me into it. I didn't belong there.
You don't consider yourself a liberal?
In some cases, yes, but not in all cases. And I certainly don't consider myself a liberal of the sort misdefined by the right wing in this country.
Well, you don't consider yourself a liberal of the sort that the American people would like to defeat in elections, huh? You don't consider yourself a partisan of big government of the sort that American people would like to defeat.
No, the people have given two opportunities in the state of Colorado, a conservative state. The voters of that state did not think I was too liberal. But I don't know where this is all leading.
Senator Hart, would you agree that if there's anything that is clear in the last decade, it is the utter failure not just of communism but of socialism as well?
Well, I think it depends on if I suppose a majority of people living in Scandinavian socialist countries or even European socialist countries may not feel that they've been, quote, utter failures. They may not be happy, but they have a vote.
Well, actually then, Senator Hart, how do you explain the fact that in Scandinavian countries such as Sweden and Norway and in European countries such as France and Britain, there is a steady move toward privatization and decentralization and away from government control?
It's great. I think it's great.
But that does suggest a certain dissatisfaction with socialism by those socialist countries,
and people
even
are
democratic socialism.
Yes, and people are expressing that and choosing a different kind of government.
There's a fascinating article of Seymour Martin Lipsitz which suggests that of all the parties of the left in the world today, only the American Democrats are not turning away from centralization and public control of almost everything.
Yeah,
you think he's wrong? He thinks he's right, actually. He gives a lot of evidence.
Senator Hart, it's your turn to interrogate Mrs. Kirkpatrick.
Ambassador Kirkpatrick, let me ask you if you believe there is something definable called the public interest?
Oh, that's a very good question. I believe that the public interest is, in fact, defined by the people, and that it does not exist independently of the opinions and the will of individual citizens.
We agree on that, and that was exactly my answer to your first question. Given that, if the private sector collectively together either chooses not to or cannot solve a social problem that a majority of the people in that society want solved, then is there a legitimate role for government to play?
I think absolutely, and I believe that that was the case in the Depression years. I believe that at the time of the Depression, which was also a time of rapid urbanization and industrialization in our country, there were problems which no one knew how to cope with, and they were very severe, and that, in fact, the government at that time solved some of those problems, finding appropriate solutions and some inappropriate solutions in the federal government and in state governments, and that the liberals derived from that the notion that the answer to problems was more government, a little like someone who concludes that because a couple of aspirin helped their headache, a bottle might help it more. And I think we've been on a more government binge ever since.
Have you heard anyone in this debate tonight advocating more government?
That's the problem with people who advocate more government. They never advocate it, they just vote for it.
I think what I heard you say was, we're not saying what you want us to say. Is that
No, I think I'm saying that you're not stating the policies which you vote in a position
Really?
to vote them,
Really?
either as citizens or as
And that
Senate.
includes the majorities in both the House and the Senate, that they're falsely...
No, that includes the four of you there tonight.
No, well, what about the Democratic majorities, the, quote, liberal Democratic majorities in both houses? Are they deceiving the majority of voters who put them there?
I regret to say. Wait, she's supposed to answer it.
I very much regret to say that I do believe that on the liberal side and on the Democratic side, there has been for quite a long time now, beginning sometime after the McGovern candidacy, a fairly systematic, persistent, predictable effort on the part of liberal Democratic candidates to soft pedal their reliance on government and their advocacy of further expansion of government power, their status as liberals, their support for socialist and semi-socialist measures, and
could you name names?
I think that's too bad.
Which Democrats are supporting socialist measures? Could you name some?
Socialist or semi-socialist.
Well, name some Democrats who are doing that. I'm not familiar. I served there for 12 years. I don't know who they are.
Actually, I wouldn't really mind doing that, but I don't want to stigmatize just one or two when there's such a large group would be guilty. You know, I take it that a semi-socialist measure, by the way, is a measure which further centralizes power over some important aspect of the economy or the society in a federal government, which transfers resources from private individuals to government, which transfers functions from private sector to the public sector.
As a matter of curiosity, since we have law enforcement agencies at the state and local level, do you think there is too much concentrated power in the FBI and the CIA?
You know, I think one of the really disturbing facts about liberals today is that they favor the centralization and enhancement of power over almost all spheres except law enforcement, where they tend to favor its shrinking. And I really regret that very much.
Or intelligence.
Thank you.
Thank you both. It's time for closing arguments. time for closing arguments. I invite Senator George McGovern to come to the podium and deliver the closing argument for the negative team.
On the question of government causing problems or bringing about solutions, there's no doubt government has brought on some problems. Vietnam comes to mind. The Watergate scandals come to mind. The Irangate scandals, the S&L scandal, and I think, yes, the one Dennis Weaver mentioned, the enormous waste in the Pentagon, which has been paralleled by equal waste in the Soviet Union. It's probably one of the reasons why Japan and Germany, defeated in World War II, have now become major world powers at a time when the economy of the Soviet Union and the United States are in increasing difficulty. And we need a strong and active and intelligent government program to begin the conversion of the excessive spending on the military side to meeting the real needs of our country. On the solution side, though, I'd like to remind you of some of the solutions government has brought. The GI Bill of Rights that many of us in this room tonight benefited from, the Park Service, the REA, the Pure Food and Drug Act, just to name a few. I don't want to be too idealistic about government, but I have lived in the nation's capital for most of my adult life, and with all of its faults, I have increasingly learned to love that capital. Not simply because it's the home for the Washington Redskins, although that's important, but because Washington is the home of the United States government. The White House, the Supreme Court, the capital of the United States, I never see those institutions without a sense of pride. And I just want to say that even the much maligned federal bureaucracy actually represents the best civil service in the world. I feel the same way about the U.S. Foreign Service, about the great departments of our government, the Department of Justice, the Department of the Treasury, Human Services, Agriculture. To paraphrase Lincoln, speaking of the United States government, do you know of any better or equal hope in the world? I'm proud of the United States government. I believe it has always provided more solutions than the problems it has caused, and I'm proud to be one of its working citizens.
Thank you. Mr. Buckley.
As I understand it, Mr. Chairman, the idea is every time we get into a war, we'll have a free education coming after that. That's a terrific bargain. I don't know why it is that the gentlemen and ladies over here can't concede that there is something organically predatory and aggressive about government. Government has, during this century, through war alone, brought about 36 million deaths. But not counting war, 2.5 times as many, 120 million deaths. 120 million people have been killed by government in the 20th century. Voltaire said the government is merely a device for taking money out of one person's pocket and putting it into another's. There is that predatory instinct that moves government. Conservatives aren't here to present solutions because there aren't solutions to most of our problems. There are only approaches. The approach of government, however, has been manifestly short-sighted. What has been done, for instance, between 1965 and 1980 for the black people pursuant to civil rights legislation? $80 billion spent, after which the rate of unemployment rose 17% among children and 29% among 20-year-olds and 70% among people in their 30s. Illegitimacy went from 17% in 1965, when these government programs went into effect to help them so much, to 61%. Was there some huge national aphrodisiac that went in with this program? No, the answer is that this was a program that didn't work. Mr. Murray, Charles Murray writes, if an impartial observer from another country were shown the data on the black lower class from 1950 to 1980, but given no information about contemporaneous changes in society or public policy, that observer would infer that racial discrimination against the blacks increased dramatically during the 60s and 70s. No, the answer is, Mr. Chairman, that the government is almost always initiating programs that don't work. And the principal reason they don't work is because there is a predatory animus within them, so that Thomas Jefferson, whom they so often quote, was not wrong when he said, "Remember, the government can only do something for the people in respect as it can do something to the people." And John Adams wasn't wrong when he said, "The government is always turning every contingency into an excuse to enhance power within itself." And Woodrow Wilson wasn't wrong when he began his book by saying, "The history of liberalism is the history of man's efforts to restrain the growth of government."
Thank you, Mr. Buckley. We listeners have many things to be grateful for tonight, but in the few remaining moments, I thought I would just mention 3 of them. Number 1, only one member of the affirmative team wore an Adam Smith tie tonight. Number 2, the affirmative team, much to my surprise, went almost 2 hours before bringing up what I regard as the rather tiresome argument that the collapse of communism proves the worldwide rejection of big government, as if there's any similarity between a totalitarian government imposed from above and a free people deciding democratically to do certain things communally as a society. The third thing we have to be grateful for is we went the entire 2 hours without hearing an equally tiresome argument that I was expecting to hear from the negative team, which is that the American response to the Persian Gulf crisis shows the value of decisive action by a powerful central government. And it was, I think, very useful that everyone conceded early on that, of course, a strong defense is the job of a central government. In fact, there was one rather surrealistic moment when Mr. Buckley seemed to be arguing against Mr. Weaver, and Mr. Buckley was arguing that the government is the solution, and Mr. Weaver was arguing that the government was the problem. And I was getting very confused at that point. At any rate, we're out of time. Thank you very much to our panelists. Thank you to Hillsdale College and President George Roche, and thank you, members of the audience. Good night.
Funding for this special debate was provided by Hillsdale College. This program was produced by SICA, which is solely responsible for its content. For a printed bound transcript of this special program, send $5 to Firing Line, Post Office Box 5966, Columbia, South Carolina 29250. Indicate the subject of the program and please allow 3 weeks for delivery.
This is PBS.
William F. Buckley, Jr. offers 20 years of Firing Line guests from the 60s to the 80s. For $19.95, you can receive this companion book by calling 1-800-872-8188. Credit cards are acceptable. Or send a check to Firing Line, 2700 Cypress Street, Columbia, South Carolina, 29205.